I'm really happy to be here. I'm also really happy to see the rest of the program. I'm super excited to see all the speakers, but I'm also happy for another reason because um, all of the speakers today will tell you a lot about the practicality of how to do futuring, which means that I have an excuse not to do that. And I like that excuse because I like zooming out. What I want to do with you today is give a little bit of an insight about why do we futures people, and especially these critical social scientists who have gotten involved in futures, insist on using the word the imagination, and what do we mean by it? And why does it matter so much how we come to imagine ideas about the future and who gets to do that? But before I dive into the futuring part, I want to have three sort of slices in time that I think exemplify something very interesting about futuring and the politics of the imagination. And we'll go through them chronologically. First, I don't know how many of you know this quote, but this is one of my favorite quotes of all time in history. It is a moment in time in 2004 where an anonymous White House aide says to a journalist, James Suskind, the following, right? People like you believe in a reality-based community who believe that solutions emerge from the judicious study of discernible reality. And then he went on, and like, that's really not the way the world works anymore. And this is where the crux is. We're an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. Now, the very strong rumor is that it was Karl Rove, who was a very senior White House aide. The thing that I find absolutely compelling about this quote is at the time, this quote was used by the liberal establishment as a reason to say, look at these people in the White House, how disconnected they are from reality, how megalomaniac they're thinking about. In retrospect, it is very prescient, but it's also very prescient about the way that the imagination works. The imagination conditions what we see as reality. It conditions the questions that we ask, but it conditions even what we see. And that really was taken up very strongly by the movement around Steve Bannon, who you can see here at a CPAC with a questionable arm pose. He said it was questionable. I think everyone else kind of knew what he meant. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. His words. The real opposition is the people who have a collective influence on what we see as reality and what we see as aspirations for the future. That's basically what he's saying. If we flood the zone with enough shit, it is very hard to have a discernible reality, to go towards a judicious study of reality. Now, for us as post-structural social theorists, which is what I consider myself to be, this is quite self-evident. But the real moment where this came into public opinion was this year at the World Economic Forum, when Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, lamented the end of the liberal world order. He said, this is not some sort of slow decline, this is a rupture, and we should really think about this very critically. But the way that he said this was very interesting for people like us. He admits we knew that the story of the international rule-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. But, and this is where the connection to futuring will come in a moment, we participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. Because, and this is the post-structural claim that I want to unpack with you today, the system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it is true. And the fragility comes from the same source. Right? So the interest here is, how do ideas about the future or ideas about political reality come to be so strong that we're all willing to perform as if they are true? Right? Ideas about the future have very little power if we aren't willing to act as if they are true. So that is sort of the entry point for me into the notion of the imagination as politics, which we analyze, which is for me really my total fascination. Why are some things normal and not others? Why do we want certain things and not others? And why do you go to a policy environment and say, I think we should maybe do something about climate change, and you just reject it out of hand as that's unrealistic, or that's utopian. We can't make that work. Who controls and how do they control the notion of realism, desirability? That's really at the heart of our kind of idea about futuring. And the point of our book about captured futures was that in environmental politics, but I think it extends much wider than just environmental politics, there is a cultural and political inability to imagine and enact, perform futures that are meaningfully different from the present. There are all kinds of ways that we produce knowledge about the future and that we give that influence in politics, through which every time the sort of range of futures that we can meaningfully think about politically gets narrowed down. The short summary here would be, it is always a techno-economic framing that it is sort of reverted back towards. The real interest for us lies in what we call a dramaturgical regime. If Mark Carney is right, and a system's power really resides in that people play along, that people perform it, the question is, what are the roles that we are performing? How are we routinized into a set of performances that we play without even realizing that we're playing them? And why do we keep playing when we know, in climate politics, for example, that it doesn't deliver the outcomes that it ostensibly delivers? So that to us is really the key question when we're thinking about futuring. How do these particular images, integrated assessment models, for example, which is always my favorite example, policy models, how do they acquire such a tremendous power over what people see as legitimate or feasible or desirable? And why is it so hard to inject other ways of knowing the future? Now, I would consider that we're sort of in a moment where that system is not just breaking politically, but is breaking in many different ways. And you get all of these authors writing about this from very different angles. In Dawn of Everything, there's a very narrow imagination of the human. And as a result, we have a very narrow idea of what politics is. Yascha Mounk, we have a very narrow idea of what democracy is. We should break it off because liberalism and democracy are not necessarily connected. John Keane writes about the assumption that democracy is the best system in terms of its ability to produce outcomes. He says, well, in the 21st century, that may not be true anymore, and we're heading towards potentially a new despotism. Not that he thinks this is desirable. Charles Meyer says, well, maybe we should look at the state from a bigger distance and say, how is power reconstituted? Rana Dasgupta does it for nations. And Jeroen Oomen says, well, maybe there are underlying ideas in the political imaginations that are shifting so fundamentally that democracy cannot continue the way that it has been doing. So we're in this moment where people seem to be observing a very massive political shift in the political imagination, both on the sort of regional, local scale, on the national scale, to the global geopolitics. But what is it when people speak about the imagination, or when they implicitly speak about the imagination, what is it that they're talking about? Well, they're basically talking about a very similar thing that Mark Carney was talking about. The assumption and the recognition that there's nothing natural about our institutional orders. We'll continue. Neither is there something natural about the future that we imagine, right? It's all performative, by which we mean it's only there to the extent that it's performed. And I always use this Judith Butler quote, who talks about it in the case of gender, because I think we should really look at it as a daily performance that we're constantly performing. And that everything that we think is a natural order in the world, because it becomes so self-evident, that is what I consider the imagination. So it's not just the imagination when you do something and you're actively imagining something different. It is the kind of social work that we all do all the time, like chuckling a little bit when a phone goes off. That is part of the imagination of what is supposed to be done in certain circumstances. So it's not just cause or effect. It is a continually re-articulated awareness of order. How do we think the world should be? It is how we imagine our social existence. And so in society, and this is where I'm segueing into futuring, there is a big struggle over what Jeroen Oomen calls the cultural resources that can produce reality effects. Right? The cultural resources that allow us to think that a certain entity or a certain political configuration is real. National flags, for example. I took an Italian example because I was here, but it's interesting to see how you have all of these, what Michael Billig calls banal forms of nationalism, to signal that this is the primary way that we organize ourselves politically, right? Now, one of the most fundamental forms of symbolic power that allows us to imagine a desirable path forward, and as a result, a political community, is ideological power and the power of the futures we imagine. And so this is where I'm segueing into the real future question. Because I deeply consider futures to be a form of ideological power in terms that they help us influence wishes and thoughts of people. So the question is, what does that mean for the political status of futures? If we imagine, say, nuclear energy to be the future, we're going to pour a lot of investment in it. So there's a constant struggle over the material effects of futures and over the ideological effects. Who gets to live in the future Europe? Right? The great replacement theory that all our countries are dealing with in some way, shape, or form is a struggle over the image of the future of our societies. So at the Urban Future Studio, one of our key questions became, we've known in all of these fields, futures literacy, sociology of expectations, anthropology of the future, all of these have noticed, sure, the future is performative, it has effects. What we're struggling with still collectively is to explain how these futures that we imagine come into being. So we're really trying to answer that question. How do imagined futures become so influential that they are performative? So we're looking into something we call techniques of futuring. And it is the practices, and really it's the practices, not the tools, that bring together actors around a particular idea of the future. This can be marketing, it can be these three speeches that we saw at the beginning, it can be climate modeling, it can be cost-benefit analysis. Regardless, they will all have a storyline with an imagined relationship between past, present, and future. Certain parts of the past will be remembered and will be made big, other parts of the past will be forgotten or not put in. You can see this very clearly in policy models, for example. Certain trends will be continued, other trends will just not be modeled at all, and certain forms of break will not make it into the model. Every time someone is trying to convince you of future, it has a certain dramaturgy. If I were a modeler, I have to adhere to very different social norms to try and convince you whether this is true than when I am, say, a marketeer. For marketeers, we allow untruths. We expect untruths. So it's a different kind of register. And of course, there is the material question. Who has the power? Who has the material infrastructure? Where's the money? Where are the models? Where are the servers? Who gets to be a speaker at a conference like this? Any sort of futuring exercise will be in that kind of space. And so what we're interested in is how the relationship between past, present, and future is always constantly reconstituted, created, talked about. What if we imagine the human past as, and this is the David Graeber and David Wengrow question, what if we imagine the human past as a sort of linear story where we take another step on the ladder of civilization every time? You get a very different idea of what the political future is than when you say, well, actually, when you look at the past, it's much more interesting because you had endless variations of political configuration. So maybe humans aren't so unidirectional after all. Now, that's a very big example, but you can put this on every single thing. And in the Netherlands, we had this moment around Black Pete, which was a blackface helper to our major, I guess, our Santa Claus. And so everyone at the first moment, there were a lot of black activists who said this character is super racist. And most white Dutch people, their first reaction was, of course it's not racist, it's just a character for kids. And in the space of 5 years, people started to realize, well, actually, if you look at this deeper history and the way that it uses symbolism, it is wildly problematic. And it's still very contested, right? So if you retell the history of things, you retell the future of things. If you retell the future of things, you retell parts of the history. So what we're claiming in the book, and what I think is relevant to all of us here, is that typically our thinking is conditioned and funneled into a very narrow idea of what politics is. And we think about it as an institutional question. Maybe we think about it as a knowledge question. But as a result, we often miss out in this broader cultural and political dimension, trying to understand, okay, but what are the ideas about past, present, and future that make it into the politics in the first place? And I wanted to share with you my favorite quote from back in time when I am explaining futuring to my students. So I'm going to share a bit of text on the screen. I'll give you a moment to read it and think about how it makes you feel. It is a 1966 article in Time magazine that went around asking inventors, engineers, professors, other kinds of experts, what will life be like in 2000? And they wrote it up in an article. There are a lot of wild claims in it. It's worthwhile just Googling it, but this is my favorite part. I will never tire of like giving this to people and having them read it for the first time, because you can see so many emotions sort of run through the faces. Mostly with the men, it's just entertainment. They're like, oh, this is kind of weird, especially with younger students who are very still angry with the world, with the women. You can see sort of running through disgust and anger, but also finding it really funny and being relieved that we're not living in this world anymore. And so I always ask my students, what do we notice here? And since I'm pressed for time, I won't do that here. But I think there are always two things that come up. The first is, actually, when you think about the technology, kind of not so far off, right? If you think about the social world, it is wild how far off they were. Now, there is a very clear explanation for this. The technological futures that you're dreaming of as a society are the ones that you're building. Right? So it makes a lot of sense that if you're dreaming of things, or all your engineers are dreaming of certain things, that's what they're building towards. The social aspect to me is the more interesting one. Because there are so many aspects here that are so self-evident to the people in this story that it is a fundamental mirror to the way that we should be thinking about when we think about the future ourselves. How are people going to react to what we do 35 years from now? When we make policy, are there similarly weird, stupid, misguided assumptions in the ways that we think about the future? And how do we have the right kind of humility? I must have shown this picture 50 times, right? And the 25th time or something, I had someone from South America in the audience, and she said, you know what really strikes me also? That they're assuming that all cooking and all living is organized in a nuclear family basis, right? Most of my students would never have thought of that, right? So there are so many aspects about this self-evidence that we think about the future that we need to somehow keep in mind. So this is where I think, and that's where I will round off, the politics of the imagination is really of the essence. What kind of implicit assumptions and explicit kinds of futuring do we allow into the way that we think about the future? Because I think, and this is really the fundamental claim that I want to throw at you today, power is much more than forcing people to follow your directives. Power is really, where the real power resides, is the capacity to influence people's preferences and aspirations, their hopes and their dreams. Because if you get there, you get so deep that you don't need to steer them anymore, right? This is why I put up all these 6 books at the beginning, because there's something freeing that allows people to now look at these kinds of implicit assumptions with a distance that wasn't there 20 years ago. And of course, this is not a new insight. People have been saying this for, well, 80 years and much longer, right? In philosophy, this has been there. But the systematic questioning of how do we come by our ideas, dreams, and aspirations is, I think, what futures and futuring should be about. If we get that into our society, into our policy, I think we'll be much richer for it. So one of the books that I've been very inspired by, and I'll close there, is this book by Taylor Dodson. It's a small book in the best sense of the word. It's short, it's accessible, and it just tells you something about how we should be viewing democracy. He says democracy should be viewed as something much more fundamental than the mere translation of popular opinion into policy, right? So, which is typically how we in the West view democracy, because we see it as a simple matter of voting and the legitimacy of the decisions by our politicians. It should be seen as a system in which people have significant influence over the decisions that affect their lives. I agree 100%, but I don't think he goes far enough. I think the question is, it should also be a system where there is transparency about how our dreams, aspirations, and ideas about the future come about, because that will influence all our notions for decision making. So in closing, we should look at politics as a rehearsed dramaturgy where we all have roles to play, and we play them without realizing that we're playing along with them. Because we're playing along with them, our imagination of other worlds typically suffers from a captured form of politics and a captured future. And so we should really try to first understand what the politics of the imagination are. And this is why I'm so happy that there are more practical people in the room. But then see ourselves also as analysts and critics, which is how I see myself, and curators of alternative practices. And we should aim to combine all of that to really rethink the way that we think about the future and to re-energize the way that we imagine alternative futures. Thank you.